Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending the presentation, What's Been Flowering on the Fort Worth Prairie. We're really glad you could join us this evening. This is a presentation of the Fort Worth chapter of the Native Prairies Association of Texas. My name is Suzanne Tuttle. I'm an officer in the chapter and a very long-time member of the Native Prairies Association. My co-host this evening is our president, our chapter president, Kate Morgan, and she's going to be helping me handle chats and questions that people may have. So let me tell you a little bit first about the Native Prairies Association of Texas. We were established in 1986, and we're a nonprofit membership organization and an accredited land trust. Our mission is dedicated to the conservation, restoration, and appreciation of native prairies, savannas, and other grasslands of Texas. NPAT currently owns or holds conservation easements on over 4,000 acres of prairies within our state. Our largest holding is in Mitchell County, the Madden Prairie outside Colorado City. It's over 1,000 acres. And then we have several properties in Northeast Texas and along the I-35 corridor. And we're always willing and welcoming to talk with you about any property that you may be interested in conserving or know of someplace we should check into. If you want more information about NPAT, here's our website URL. It's Texas Prairie, not prairies, but prairie.org. So a few ground rules for tonight's presentation. Please keep your video screen turned off to conserve bandwidth. I'm broadcasting from my home and I don't have a very high power internet connection, so that might help everyone have a better experience. Please mute your audio. I've muted everyone to prevent unexpected interruptions, but you have been empowered to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. I love this subject, but many of you that I've seen the registration list, many of you could certainly teach this class probably a lot better than me. So, so please feel free to make comments, to correct me if I say something wrong, to ask questions. And please, for the most part, please enter questions or comments into chat. Kate is going to monitor that, and she will feed questions and comments to me so that I can answer things in a timely way. But we'll also have time reserved at the end of the presentation for live conversation. So to get started, I first wanted to explain a little bit, especially I know there's some people on the call this evening that are not Fort Worth or Dallas-Fort Worth area residents. So you may not be familiar at all with the Fort Worth Prairie or our part of the state. So this is a map that was published in the Illustrated Flora of North Central Texas that was published by the Botanical Research Institute of Texas here in Fort Worth in the late 1990s. And it's a great illustrative map of our the different vegetation types. This part of North Central Texas, it takes up a relatively small percentage of the state, but it's an extremely busy area geologically. Lots of overlapping geologic formations and therefore differing plant communities. So you can see here at the bottom, here's the state of Texas, obviously, with the area of enlargement shown and the legend of what these different abbreviations stand for. So the Fort Worth Prairie is this strip of exposed limestone in the sage green color that runs north to south up almost to the Red River. And it connects on the south end to the what's on here called Lampasas Cut Plain. Currently, most people call it the Limestone Cut Plain. Then the Fort Worth Prairie, which is limestone-based soil, is flanked on both sides by cross timbers, the eastern and the western cross timbers. The cross timber soil is based on sandstone. So the prairie soil was laid down when this was a marine environment, fairly deep water ocean, when there was a central ocean through the mid part of the North American continent. The cross timbers, sandy soil, sandstone was laid down when there was either large rivers, riverine deposits, or beach. So, like I said, very active geologically. And then on the other side of the eastern cross timbers is the Blackland Prairie, which is also limestone based. So you've got what's represented is differing water depths as over the course of millions and millions of years. So the Fort Worth Prairie is sometimes called the Grand Prairie, and I prefer the term Fort Worth Prairie for a couple of reasons. One is Fort Worth is the primary large city that falls within this plant community. So it tells you exactly where the Fort Worth Prairie is or what surrounds it. The other reason is there is a suburb of Dallas in southwest Dallas County that is called, the name of the suburb is Grand Prairie, but the city of Grand Prairie is on the Blackland Prairie, which I think might really confuse people. So I just prefer to use the term Fort Worth Prairie. I also have seen people when they are talking about the combined geologic and plant community of Fort Worth Prairie and limestone cut plain, I've seen people call that Grand Prairie, which makes more sense because that's a larger area that it covers. And the limestone cut plain is very similar to the Fort Worth Prairie. It's just that the topography is somewhat different. So what are some characteristics of the Fort Worth Prairie? Again, it's highly alkaline clay and gravel soil composed of a Cretaceous-based limestone laid down when this was at the bottom of an ocean. A lot of the gravel is actually pieces of fossilized oysters and other sea urchins, things like that. You can easily find them when you're out walking around on a prairie site. The true prairie ecosystem of the Fort Worth Prairie, it only had historically 5 to 10% woody cover, and the woody plants were primarily restricted to low spots, creeks, river courses where fire didn't have as much influence because this was a highly flammable and frequently burned ecosystem. And it's very thin soil on hilltops. Also, often with what's called a barrens plant community. If you're more familiar with the Eastern U.S. terminology, a limestone hill like in Missouri or the Appalachians that's got very thin soil and a grassy plant community is oftentimes called a glade. So it could be, you could have heard the word glade to describe this before, but regardless, it's a plant community that's fairly unique. It survives on a tiny amount of soil and very heavily cracked limestone where the roots get in. This photograph illustrates a place at the Fort Worth Nature Center called Farview Prairie. It's on the Oakmont Trail, and this is a barren location. It's up on a hilltop, very, very thin soil, lots of gravel and limestone outcrops. So what's flowering now on the Fort Worth Prairie is my pandemic project. I started it on April 15th. I've been posting to the Fort Worth NPAT Facebook page every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I've been posting photos that I've taken of what's flowering. And so currently I'm on hiatus because there's not much flowering now, being 1st of August, the depths of summer. I'm hoping in 2 or 3 weeks that things will get back to their fall flowering and I can start publishing again. It has created an added benefit of, I've created a phenological record, or I've got the start of a phenological record of what's flowering at what time. And I've got everything dated and cataloged in file folders on my computer, so I can look back and say, oh, well, on the first thing I published was foxglove on April 15th. Well, foxglove was flowering at this date in 2020. So this presentation, I'm primarily focusing on perennial flowers. There are a couple of annuals, but 18 of the 20 plants that we're going to highlight are perennials. And the reason for that is because annuals, while they are found on the Fort Worth Prairie, they tend to move around. They, they'll flower, go through their entire life cycle, set seed, and die. And then the next year, they may not come up in that spot. They may come up in a totally different spot. Where perennials, they don't move. They're rooted to the ground, obviously. They actually tend to characterize or to highlight the character of the prairie, the Fort Worth Prairie. We have several endemic plants that are only found on the Fort Worth Prairie and limestone cut plain. They're called endemics because their global range is so restricted, and they're extremely good indicators of a high quality prairie when you find those. So the first plant we're going to cover this evening is foxglove. This was the first plant that I featured on April 15th. Foxglove is one of those amazing flowers that I am in awe that they are able to just flower so beautifully without any kind of a human intervention. This is my home, and I have an acre, and I have a prairie patch on about half of my property. And this is a limestone hill. It's hard to tell because there's so much green vegetation, but there's lots of gravel. Limestone outcrops are showing, and the penstemon are just beautiful. And they seem to really like it here because when I first started caretaking this little prairie, there was only a handful of penstemon plants on it, and now they have really spread, and they are great for pollinators. Bumblebees love them. Interestingly, the taxonomy of this family has changed. Foxglove itself, and Penstemon cobea as its scientific name, that hasn't changed. But when I first started studying botany, foxglove was in a family called Scrophulariaceae, or the figwort family. And due to genetic studies, a lot of DNA has, studying DNA has really changed our understanding of how different families of plants and different species within those families are related. Penstemon's actually been moved out of the Scrophulariaceae family into the plantain family, the Plantaginaceae family, which really surprises me because plantain, the genus Plantago, is a very plain flowering plant. It's kind of got greenish flowers. The plants are small and they form like a ground cover. They're important plants in prairies and they're very ubiquitous. But it just surprises me that such a gorgeous, showy plant is now classified in the Plantaginaceae family. So our next flower is just as beautiful and just as amazing to me that it grows in such inhospitable places. This is literally the gravel shoulder of a county road at the edge of my neighborhood. Missouri primrose, also called fluttermill because of the way its flowers flutter in the wind. Scientific name is Enothera or Enothera macrocarpa, which means large-seeded. And if you're familiar with this flower and its seed capsule, the ovary expands when it's been pollinated. The ovary expands and it makes a capsule about this big around that has 4 very distinct wings. That's why it's called macrocarpa, big-seeded. So some interesting things about this plant are, here's a bud that hasn't opened yet, and when the bud opens, you know, the sheath will peel back and it becomes the sepals. This long tube is called the hypanthium, and this is the pollen tube. And way down here, it's almost too tiny to even see yet. This is the ovary where that'll turn into that big papery four-winged capsule. And the hypanthium, the pollen has to travel down the hypanthium all the way to the ovary in order to pollinate. Well, what has such a long tongue that it can reach all the way down to that ovary? It's the large night-flying sphinx moths or hawk moths, like white-lined sphinx. And they have a very long proboscis. This hypanthium is probably 4 or 5 inches long. And so when those big moths unfurl their proboscis, it's several inches long. Evening primrose are called evening primrose because they open in the evening. They are open all night, and then they close sometime in the morning, depending on if it's sunny or cloudy. They stay open longer if it's cloudy. And the moths fly at night, and that's why it's important. That's why it's important for these flowers to open when they do. Everything's synchronized. And members of this family all have light-colored flowers, light yellow, white, light pink, like the very common roadside primrose that we have every spring. And that's so that they're more visible at night. So our next plant, I mentioned endemic plants before, and Engelmann sage is an example of one of the endemics I was talking about. Engelmann sage is, its entire global range is only found on the Fort Worth and limestone cut plain prairies. So this is a really important indicator that you're in this Fort Worth Prairie limestone cut plain ecosystem. Engelmann sage loves growing again on these rocky limestone hilltops, puts down very large root systems, pretty difficult to transplant. We have a number of other sages that flower on our prairies: Texas sage, mealy blue sage. We also have a sage cousin called Scutellaria or skullcap. Those all flower in the spring. But I picked Engelmann sage because it is an endemic and it is really indicative of the Fort Worth Prairie. Some other interesting things about this flower is that if you look closely, this is a very characteristic component of the salvia or sage family. The flowers have these white runways that lead pollinating insects down into their throat where they can retrieve pollen and deposit pollen. Insects see light in a different wavelength than humans, and they do see quite well in the ultraviolet range. And so when these flowers are exposed to ultraviolet light, these runways glow brightly, and so it really helps direct those insects. The other nice thing about Engelmann sage is that it is very fragrant when it's disturbed, and walking through a field of this is quite a sensory experience. I love the smell of Engelmann sage. It's sort of a cinnamony, patchouli smell. It's very, very nice. Our next flowers, we have a couple of different common species of winecup here on the Fort Worth Prairie. Caloroe involucrata and Caloroe pedata. And a lot of people are confused about how to tell the difference between these two because the flowers are very similar looking. Usually they're purple, although sometimes pedata's flowers are white, but usually they're purple. So how can you tell the difference between these two species? Well, the name of Caloroe involucrata gives you a little clue. Involucrata means having an invicell. And what is an invicell? Well, if you look at where I circled here on this picture of the involucrata, these large green appendages are the sepals. That was the bud cover of the flower before it opened. But then down here below the sepals, there's little extra appendages, and there's actually 3 of them, but the other one is sticking out the other side, so you can't see it away from us. This is the involucell. So the presence of this means it's involucrata. If you look at pedata over here, you can see in that same area you've got the sepals, but you have no involucell. The other way to tell them apart is by their foliage. Involucrata has larger 5-parted or 5-petaled, so to speak, hand-like leaves that are fairly fleshy and smooth. Involucrata also, it's also called prostrate wine cup because it tends to form more of a ground cover and grow along the ground. Pedata is called standing wine cup, and that gives you a clue that it's more erect and stands up higher above the grass. Its leaves are hard to see in this picture because of the grass, but they are very narrow and linear, like long, narrow fingers. So quite different looking than the involucrata leaves. So that's telling the difference between Caloroe involucrata and Caloroe pedata, the prostrate wine cup and the standing wine cup. Antelope horn milkweed, one of the critical milkweeds for the monarch migration, but it's also critical for a lot of other pollinating insects that use this plant. The milkweeds have what's called a bimodal growth. They'll grow, flower, and in the spring, and then when the hot weather sets in, most of the milkweeds will die almost completely back. Sometimes you may think they're completely dead or they disappear, and then they'll resprout again in the fall and sometimes even flower again. And it's, unfortunately, probably not a coincidence, their growth and flowering almost perfectly coincides with monarch migration, which is obviously critical since the caterpillars eat this milkweed along with the other species that we have, like green milkweed and green comet. Again, you can see this was on a roadside. I live in a semi-rural neighborhood, and at the entrance to my neighborhood, there's a really nice prairie remnant. And I took a lot of these photographs at this prairie remnant at the entrance to my neighborhood. So the antelope horn has very narrow leaves, almost linear leaves. Reason it's called antelope horn is not the leaves, it's because when it goes to seed, the seed capsule looks like a long tapering horn. And I know a lot of y'all have seen that. Any questions, Kate?
No more.
Okay.
Not yet.
Purple paintbrush. So as you go farther west, the Indian paintbrush, which is the orange annual flower, gives way to these brightly colored, mostly purple, but there's other colors, perennials. So how do you tell the difference between the Indian paintbrush, which is annual, and the purple paintbrush, which is perennial? Well, the scientific name for Indian paintbrush is Castellagia indivisa. And the reason it's called indivisa is because the leaves are undivided. They're simply rounded. On purple paintbrush, these are the leaves, and look how lobed and fractured they look. So that's one way you can tell, because there are some purple paintbrush. It's not very common, but there is a subspecies that is orange. So that's how you could tell whether that was the annual or the perennial. Paintbrushes used to be in the Scrophulariaceae family, the same family with foxglove, but paintbrushes got moved out too. They got moved to the broomrape family, the Orobanchiaceae, because they're semi-parasitic, and that Orobanchiaceae family are parasites primarily. So so that one changed its at least its taxonomic family also. Another interesting thing about the paintbrushes is the colored part you see is not the flowers. Those are colored bracts, in the same way that a poinsettia, the red leaves on a poinsettia are not the flowers. Those are colored leaves or bracts. The actual flowers in purple paintbrush are these green projections, the stigma, where the pollen is received, sticking up above the bracts. All right, moving on. No questions, Kate?
Nope.
Okay. Good. All right, Barbara's buttons. I have to admit, this is one of my favorite prairie wildflowers. I just love Barbara's buttons. This is in the sunflower family. And we'll look at some other sunflowers because they're obvious, or other members of the sunflower family, because they're obviously very common in prairie areas, possibly one of the most common families out on prairies. Barbara's buttons like seepy areas, so a lot of times you'll find them growing on hillsides where there might be water seeping out of the hillside. That you can see how they open. The outer, okay, let me back up 1 second. The sunflower family, the Asteraceae, used to be called the composite family. And the reason it was called the composite family was because what looks like a single flowering head is actually a composite of a whole bunch of very tiny little flowers. And so aster is a very big genus in the Asteraceae. That's why they named the family that. So that's why they changed the name when they went to the new nomenclature for the botanical families. But you can see how each one of these little flowers opens up from the outside and they kind of spiral into the center. And this one you can see almost all of the flowers are open now, the individual flowers, just a few buds left to open. And each one of these little tiny flowers produces a little teeny tiny achene, which looks little sunflower seed. They look just like big sunflower seeds that you eat, except they're very, very small. These wonderful beetles that are visiting this Barbara's buttons are Kern's flower beetles, and I love them too. I was very happy to see them on. This is in my neighborhood. There's a slope. Some of the people who live in my neighborhood don't keep their yard, you know, like a suburban yard. They keep it like a little wild yard, like mine. And so this is on the slope behind someone's house in my neighborhood, and they have a whole colony of Barbara's buttons growing down their slope. So I love walking by their house.
Suzanne, we have a question back on the paintbrushes, and
okay.
The question is, it's from Laura Bunton. She asks, what species are the paintbrushes parasitic on?
I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe somebody else out there may have a better answer. I think they're parasitic on little blue stem. Does anybody else have other information about that? I can definitely look that up, but I'm pretty sure that I had heard that it was little blue stem, although I have to admit I didn't research that. Anything else? Okay.
Nope.
Okay, this is one of the annuals. This is Prairie Bishop. The reason I included it is because it seems to be sort of an indicator species to some degree of Fort Worth Prairie. It's extremely common in the spring on the Fort Worth Prairie in a way that other wildflowers, it just seems to be like an indicator of this habitat. It's in the carrot family, and the reason it's called Prairie Bishop, which is kind of an interesting name, is because when you have a big colony of this growing all across the field, it looks just like somebody laid a lace tablecloth across the ground. And there is a very similar cousin to this plant in Europe that's called bishop's weed. And so the belief is that when colonists came to this country from Europe and they saw this flower growing, they named it after their familiar flower in Europe. It is, like I said, it is an annual, comes back pretty readily from seed. It looks a lot like the really hated non-native beggar's ticks, Torillus. because they're in the same family. But the seeds on these are not sticky Velcro like Pterilus is. And the foliage, it looks like dill. Dill is in the same family as this too. And the foliage is very fine and lacy like dill, not coarse like Pterilus is. So please don't pull this up if you have this come up and you don't, please don't pull it up thinking it's beggar's ticks.
Suzanne,
Yes.
how tall is Prairie Bishop?
Obviously it depends a little bit on rain, but it usually is about calf high. Somewhere, you know, sometimes I've seen it as short as ankle high, but usually about mid calf. Anything else?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, well, our native coneflower to the Fort Worth Prairie, especially on the western side, is the narrow-leaved coneflower. The species name, angustifolia. Angust means narrow foliage. So that's a perfect name for this flower. Again, this is in the sunflower family. You can see the narrow leaves. You can see a photobomb by a pale yucca, which we'll get to here in a second, because this is another endemic. But narrow-leaf coneflower, again, this is in the sunflower family. So these are actually not petals per se. These are actually ray flowers that connect to a little flower there inside the cup or receptacle that holds all the flowers. And then this is called the disc. So back with the barber's buttons. Barber's buttons do not have ray flowers. They only have a disc. Coneflower has both a disc and rays. Sometimes only the disc flowers are fertile and the ray flowers are sterile on some species of things in the sunflower family. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the ray flowers are fertile and the disc flowers are sterile. In the case of coneflower, it's the disc flowers that are fertile, and the seeds actually develop they're not these spikes that poke out, but they are way down inside they're like protected down inside those spikes, and you kind of have to knock them out. Or I've actually gotten the seeds out of these by putting them in a food processor and kind of just pulsing it to get the seeds to knock out of it. So now we're getting into May, because these actually usually flower first part of May. And Prairie Bishop also typically flowers very late April or first part of May. Okay, next. Pale yucca. Pale yucca is another endemic. Its entire global range is restricted to the Fort Worth Prairie and the limestone cut plain. So these are a couple of pictures. This is the little prairie remnant in my neighborhood. So pale yucca in its normal habitat with some Indian paintbrush and, oh gosh, Stillingia. There's lots of wonderful things in this little prairie. This yucca in flower is in my yard. I've got a lot of yuccas around my yard, and I've just incorporated them into our landscaping because I love them. Yuccas used to be in the agave family, but this is another taxonomic change. The agave family was basically dissolved, and everything was put into the asparagus family, Asparagaceae, and that actually includes, which surprised me, that actually includes some things like wild hyacinth and blue funnel lily. Those got moved into the Asparagaceae family, so that really surprised me. Trout lily, which is my favorite wildflower, still stayed in the lily family, so I was relieved to hear that. Okay, moving on. Prairie Queen's Delight, or Texas Stillingia. And again, we can't really seem to get away from the pale yucca because they're so common in this Fort Worth Prairie habitat. Stillingia.
Suzanne, could
Yeah.
I interrupt you just a
Sure.
second? Back on the yucca, who feeds on yucca?
You mean the flowers?
I think so. It's Lisa who asked.
Okay. Actually, that's a great question. Yuccas have a very critical symbiotic relationship with a family of moths called the yucca moths. And I wish I had a picture of a close-up of a yucca capsule, but yuccas are monocots, so they have one seed leaf, and their plant parts are in threes. And so their seed capsule has 3 carpels, which are the chambers of the ovaries, chambers of the seed capsule. And the seeds are stacked up in there like little coins. And yucca moths will lay their egg. They pretty much spend their entire life up inside the yucca flowers because the flowers nod towards the ground. Yucca moths lay their eggs on flower, and the caterpillar develops typically in one carpel, and it eats through one stack of seeds. And in return for giving up some of its seeds, the moths pollinate the yuccas. And so a lot of yuccas don't ever have a chance to reproduce via seed because the yucca moths have gotten less and less and less common. The other animal, actually white-tailed deer, love yucca. If you've obviously seen it when the flower shoot starts to come up, it looks like a big, huge asparagus stalk. And oh my gosh, white-tailed deer love asparagus stalk yuccas. So a lot of times they never even have a chance to flower because the deer are eating the stalks before they can ever bloom. Okay? Okay. Back to Queen's Delight. Stillingia is in the Euphorbia family, so it doesn't have very showy flowers. This is as showy as they get, a kind of a pale lemony yellow color coming up, and some of as the other euphorbs, poinsettia is a euphorbia. So it does have bracts that turn this lemony yellow color also that surround the flower. And these are also, to me, a Fort Worth Prairie indicator. I seem to see them a lot on really good remnant prairie sites. I always look for them because, to me, if I find Stillingia, that often means that the site is a really excellent site. And then I put this picture in just so you could see what the seed capsules look like after the flowers fade. So this is another picture. This is actually the same plant with the pale yucca there in the background. And this is in the little remnant at the entrance to my neighborhood. Okay, two-leaf senna. Now we're really getting into mid to almost late May. Two-leaf senna is in the pea family, and you probably couldn't really tell it so much by the flowers. They're not a super traditional pea flower shape, but it does have compound leaves. It's called two-leaf senna because it has compound leaves in bunches of 2. And the pods that it makes are really distinctive. If you see these pods, if you saw them close up, they have little striations in them too that go around the pod, and so they're really distinctive. You don't even have to see the flowers. You can see old pods and know that that plant was a two-leaf senna. Really, really pretty golden yellow color flowers. I love senna. And again, you look at the limestone hillside it's growing on. One of those you could probably kill with kindness if you were too nice to it trying to grow it in a flower bed. Peas are extremely important in prairie ecosystems because they have the symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria, and the bacteria that live in nodules on the roots of the peas can actually take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it into a fertilizer, and that self-fertilizes the prairie. So usually in really good prairie sites, you'll see a lot of perennial peas like indigo, senna, prairie clover, because they're doing that important role of doing nitrogen fixing and fertilizing those prairies. Sensitive briar, which kids and big kids alike love playing with sensitive briar. This is another pea. This one makes a ground cover. And if you've ever played with sensitive briar, you'll know that if you touch these leaves, they fold up really quick. I've read about what the reason is for that, and some plant physiologists believe that it's to make their profile smaller so that if they're being grazed on or browsed, that they lessen the amount of plant material that gets consumed. So that makes sense to me, but it's just amazing how quickly they can do it. They just will immediately fold up. These do have prickly stems, and they typically do run across the ground very low, and a lot of times they're actually forming a ground cover or mat under the overstory of the tall grass. The prairie is like a forest, kind of shrunk down, miniaturized, where the tall grass is the tall trees, and then you have this whole set of life going on in the understory down under the tall grass. This is along the edge of the road in my neighborhood. There's a house that has a whole big colony of this around their mailbox, and I just love walking by and messing with the leaves. Oh, and it makes a really cool pod. The pod looks like, of course it's a pea, so it does make pods. The pods look like prickly wild hair that just stick out like a fingers, and they have little spines on them. They're prickly. Okay. All right, bluebell. This was a treasure. I just went on a wonderful prairie walk with some prairie friends at the LBJ grasslands, and the bluebells, this was just like a week ago. They were still flowering so beautiful on a hillside. Bluebells have gotten less and less common because they're so beautiful that people dig them up and take them home, sadly. So it's really important. They're not very long-lived perennials. In fact, in some cases, they actually behave as annuals. So it's really important to let these go to seed and not dig them up and take them out of the wild. They are gentian, as the name implies, and just probably one of our most spectacular wildflowers. They love to grow in wet areas or seep areas, areas where water seeps out of the ground or it collects after a rain, edges of bar ditches, hillside seeps. Can't think of anything else. Any questions or anything, Kate?
Nope, a comment about how pretty they are.
Oh, they are really beautiful. And the foliage, if you can see the foliage pretty well in this picture here on the right, it's sort of a bluish green color, and it's almost succulent feeling. It's got a fleshiness to it, and it's actually very easy to spot the rosettes even before the flowers come out because they're a very unusual color and texture. Really a wonderful flower. This is another one. It's like the foxglove. Almost all of these flowers, you look at them and go, how can this possibly be growing wild without anybody taking care of it? It's just so wonderful to find them. If there was any flower that I think personifies Fort Worth Prairie, it's white rosinweed. White rosinweed is endemic. It only grows on Fort Worth Prairie and Limestone Cut Plain. If you find these, you definitely have found a remnant prairie, because these do not survive overgrazing. They do not survive cultivation like farm fields. They are really a treasure. And sadly, I know from experience, you really can't transplant them either, because what they do is they have this incredible root system that may go down like 14 feet. And they grow on this fractured limestone, and they find all the cracks in the limestone, and they'll put roots down in through all these cracks. And when you try to transplant them, because I've done a lot of plant rescues and tried to save them, but you can't get enough of the root out. It's all down in the cracks. So to me, the solution to that is, let's try not to develop all these areas where the silphium grows. Unfortunately, it loves flat plateau hilltops, which are obviously very prime locations to build. So I just really enjoy them when I find them. They're in the sunflower family. This beautiful specimen here was growing on Farm Road 730 between Weatherford and Azle. There was a couple of, I think it was in 2017, I think, we had a really rainy spring, and it rained so much that the county mowers couldn't mow along that roadside, and this whole colony of these white rosinweed came up. And I took some pictures then when I got the opportunity to do that. I saw a note that Lori Chernosky raised her hand. Lori, you want
yes,
to
we have
unmute yourself and ask a question?
What? Actually, I don't know how I put that up there, and I don't know how to take it off. I'm sorry.
No worries at all.
I'm new to this Zoom thing, so I'm not sure. But I did have a question that I had typed in about, have you ever tried to grow the bluebells from seed? Because I was able to collect some seed last year, and I'm just curious. They are so tiny. It's smaller than pepper, or the seed is so fine. I just wondered if anybody has ever tried to grow bluebells. And I'll hang up now, I think.
Well, I personally have not, but they must be relatively easy to grow, because the Japanese appropriated bluebells and took them back to Japan and hybridized them, and now they're a flower you can buy on the commercial market called Lisianthus. And so if anybody has any info about growing bluebells from seed, please unmute yourself and let us know.
This is Sandy Fountain. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
We had a young man in the Native Plant Society that grew them from seed and put them in our sales in this, I think it was in the spring a few years ago. And he said the key to growing them from seed is you have to keep them moist, consistently moist, for like 6 to 8 weeks for them to germinate.
Ah, well, that makes sense. No, I direct seeded out into the field, so I guess I didn't do the right thing on that. Thank you for that information. I still have some seeds, so I will try again on that.
Well, Lori, what I would do is, if you've got a low spot or a place that tends to hold water, if you want to sow them out in the wild, that would be the place to sow them, because they do like to be damp. And when you find them in the wild, they're always growing in wet places that either seep water after rain or hold water, like a bar ditch or something like that.
Well, where I got them from, they were more or less like in a pasture type area along, it was a pretty big field next to where some cattle were. So it didn't appear to be too wet, but I will take the information about keeping them more moist. That is not what I did with them. So, and I didn't know what time of year, if it matters. I know that I'm trying to follow the same as what Mother Nature would do. You know, they'd be dropping in late August. So that's when I tried to just put them out here too.
Yeah, well, and that, to me, that's always the best rule of thumb when you're working with wildflowers or wild grass seed, is just sow it when nature would have normally dropped it.
Well, I'm keeping my fingers crossed, so there's still hope.
Well, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
Suzanne, we have several questions about the silphium.
Okay.
And the first one
We're
is
back on it.
From Corina Benson. What about collecting seed?
Okay. Silphium, again, this is in the sunflower family. So it has gray flowers and it has disc flowers. And in the case of silphium, it's the ray flowers that are fertile. All the stuff in the middle that you find on a dried flower head of silphium is all just chaff. It's not seed. The seeds look like flat, kind of jagged pieces of dark brown paper around the edge, and that's where you'll find that. I mean, that those are the fertile seeds. So if you're going to collect seed from Silphium albiflorum or Silphium laciniatum, any of the silphiums, that's one of the characteristics of the genus Silphium, is that their ray flowers are fertile, not their disc flowers. So that's where you need to look, is around the edge.
And another question from Kitty Bartlett, is that little blue stem in the background?
Yes, yes, this is little blue stem on this roadside of 730.
Lorraine asks if the silphium is endemic to this area.
Yes, it's endemic to this area, and yes, and this is the Fort Worth Prairie and limestone cut plain are its only natural habitat globally.
How tall is it? Marianne Armstrong asks.
That's very rainfall dependent, I found, but like this one here was about 2 feet tall. This is one from the little prairie at the end of my neighborhood on 9 Mile Bridge Road. You can see in the background there's Selengia. This one was only about 1 foot tall. So it really depends a lot on, I think, rainfall.
And Newt wants to know, what is the best book of these wildflowers, or are there several books that are good?
Gosh, I have a lot of wildflower books. Hang on 1 second, let me. This is the book. You can tell I've used it a lot. In fact, it's completely fallen apart. I need to get it ring bound. But this is, for many years, this has been my favorite wildflower book.
It may not be very clear. Suzanne, will you read the title, please?
Yes, Wildflowers of the Texas Hill Country by Marshall Enquist. And if on the back, it shows a map of where the region that he covered, and you can see the Lampasas cut plain is included in this book. And I found that probably 90% of the plants in this book we have on the Fort Worth Prairie, and of course the limestone cut plain. So I've really enjoyed having this book. It's really not easy to find anymore. I don't think it's in print anymore. But I also have Michael Eason's book.
Michael's book is a great book.
Another really good one.
Michael's book is a great book.
It is a great book. Wildflowers of Texas by Michael Eason. He's one of the vice presidents of the Native Plant Society in Texas. And then my friend Mary Curry, who's one of my prairie wanderers, she put together a wonderful book called North Central Texas Wildflowers. It has everything in it that we can find in our area. So it's Mary Curry, North Central Texas Wildflowers. I think she self-published this. So Mary, I think you're out there somewhere. How do people get a copy of this if they want it? Mary out there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazon.
Oh, okay. Wasn't sure if you were still selling on Amazon. Good.
Yeah, or you can contact me and I can get it for you too.
Okay, great.
We're all caught up.
Okay, wonderful. So if you find white rosinweed, you have found a very, very high quality Fort Worth prairie. So this is my second annual flower, not a perennial, but I just love these mountain pinks so much. You can see where it was growing. This was the side of a bar ditch up near St. Joe. They're in the gentian family, same family as bluebells, meadow pinks, ladybird centauri, all in the same family. But look at where they grow like a bouquet. Like you could just pick this one cluster and it would be like the most perfect bouquet. And these they look like little pink clouds growing up hillsides. They're just so, so pretty. Again, they're annual, so they have to come up from seed every year. They like disturbed areas, so you typically see them growing on rocky hillsides where there's not much soil and there's not much of any other cover either. So just a real delight when I find these. All right. Back to another pea family plant, golden prairie clover, cousin to purple prairie clover, which is a little bit more common. You can see the characteristics of the pea family, the compound pinnate leaves. So they grow with a central midrib and then little leaflets coming off of the central midrib. That's pinnate. Palmate is where they're a compound, but they have leaflets that all irradiate from the same point, like a palm of a hand. Again, this is my little prairie remnant at the end of my neighborhood. There's another pale yucca lurking in the background. And a nitrogen fixer. This was flowering in June, like mid-June. And it's still flowering. There's still some of it flowering down there at that spot. So another important member of the nutrient cycling on a prairie. Blazing star, gay feather, liatris, liatris. I've heard a lot of pronunciations. But this is the summer flowering blazing star, Liatris estivalis, and estivalis is Latin for summer. So this is the summer liatris. This actually is a relatively newly described species of liatris that when I first started working at the Nature Center, it had not been officially discovered, quote unquote, or named. It does flower in the depths of summer instead of flowering in the fall, which is when the typical flowering period is for liatris. One of the distinguishing characteristics of it is it usually has a very truncated flower head like these. You can see it was growing on limey gravel. This is at the LBJ grasslands. Some little blue stem coming up here. This is in the sunflower family. So instead of having a disc with ray flowers, the flowers grow in these little packets. That's the composite. There's multiple flowers in each little packet. And that packet is not a technical term. That's just my description. So any questions out there, Kate?
No more.
Okay. Shiny goldenrod. This is really flowering right now too. We're starting to get into the fall flowers. This used to be called, I guess some people probably still do call it flat top goldenrod. The traditional or the more common species of goldenrod typically have more of a pyramidal shaped flowering head, where the shiny goldenrod is flat topped. Extremely attractive to pollinators. This picture doesn't have, but there was a little tiny yellow, perfectly camouflaged crab spider on a different goldenrod, different plant, that was just waiting for some unsuspecting bee or fly or something to come land for nectar or for pollen on this plant. Just amazing the camouflage that spider had. So these are starting to really flower now. Now we're getting into July, and the next flower, this is our last one. The next one is whitlowwort. This is technically a fall flowering plant. It's starting to flower now. This was growing on the top of a gravel hill. You can see the gravel. Whitlowwort grows in these wonderful squared off packets again. Very regular branching. This is in the carnation family, which I find really interesting. We don't have many carnation family members in our area, and this is one of the prominent ones we do have. In old medicine, herbal medicine, if something's called a wart, W-O-R-T, it usually has some kind of medicinal properties. And whitlow was an old term for nail fungus. So apparently whitlowwort was believed to have some kind of efficacy against nail fungus. I don't know how it was used, whether they made some kind of poultice that was wrapped on the fingers or the toes, or if it was, I doubt they ate it, but probably just made a poultice of it.
Then we have a question about goldenrod. Is it in the same family as coneflower?
Yes. Goldenrod is also in the sunflower family, and coneflower is in the sunflower family. So yes, they are in the same family. Anything else?
No, we're caught up.
Okay. Well, that's the last flower. And just a little bit more information about our chapter. If you live in this area and you're interested in joining us for any of our Prairie Rambles, educational activities, there's 5 chapters of NPAT in Texas. We regularly meet on this night of the month, the second Monday of the month. Obviously, we haven't been able to have in-person meetings, so we've been putting together virtual presentations. Hopefully in the fall, we might be able to take some small groups out for some prairie walks. We ought to be able to keep safely distanced. If you'd like to get on our mailing list or to get our newsletter or other notifications about meetings, this is our email address, fwnpat@gmail.com, and our website that has copies of our publications, and we do also have our own Facebook page separate from the state NPAT organization. It's called Fort Worth Chapter of Native Prairies Association of Texas.
So Suzanne, we have a couple of questions. The first one, it came a little earlier, wanted to know where to see the What's Flowering Now, where to find it on the internet.
Okay, the What's Flowering Now is on the Fort Worth NPAT Facebook page. So if you go up to search and just type in Fort Worth chapter native, it ought to come up. And I started putting flowers out there on April 15th, and I've been putting them out there every Monday, Wednesday, Friday up until today. And I'm going to take a couple of weeks off to wait for flowers to start flowering again, and then I'll get back to it in the fall.
We have a question from Donald Verser, who's in Houston. He says, you mentioned your neighborhood remnant a few times. Could you describe it a bit more? Do your neighbors appreciate it? And are you concerned about its future?
Okay. Everybody in our neighborhood has at least an acre. Like I said, we're in a semi-rural area on the northwest edge of Tarrant County. Technically, we're not even in Fort Worth. I have a Fort Worth mailing address, but I live in the county. One of the main entrances to our neighborhood comes to a T at a rural road called 9 Mile Bridge Road. The people who live on the southwest corner have this prairie remnant on their property, and yes, they definitely appreciate it, and they've left it completely native, although they don't really manage it per se, but they didn't clear it all out. They don't use it, for anything else other than a prairie. So that's about half of it, and then right straight across the street, across 9 Mile Bridge Road, is where the rest of the remnant is that I like to visit. And I do have a lot of concern about that remnant because, for one thing, a lot of the really good stuff is in the road right away, so it gets mowed a lot. There were 2 Silphium albiflorums that flowered there this year, and one of them was close enough up to the fence it didn't get mowed, the one that I took the picture of, the flower head. The other one got mowed, so I was really sad about that. The other thing is, I don't know who owns that property and when it might be developed, but there's a pipeline going through there, so that actually might hinder development somewhat. They put in a barnet gathering pipeline right on the other side of the fence, so part of the remnant that was really nice got dug up for the pipeline, but then there's still this strip that's been, at least for now, conserved by accident.
Lisa asks if this presentation has been recorded, and we are recording it.
Yes.
There are lots of thank yous. Suzanne, you'll have to read the actual end of the chat. There's a lot of what a wonderful presentation it was. And,
oh, great. Thank you.
And I have to agree. And someone very helpfully posted the link to the Facebook page for Suzanne's What's Blooming post. So if you are still on the call and you want to see what that link looks like, it's toward the end of the group chat at the moment. That's it.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, I really thank you all so much for coming. What a nice group of folks. And I love the naturalist community, so I'm very happy to be here with you. So I guess, Kate, we can turn off the recording. Anybody else want to just chat or?